This is Mildred Barya coming from POETRIO, Malaprop, and I am very excited today to have three wonderful poets, Sally Rosen Kindred, Rick Mulkey, and Crystal Stone. And the first poet that I have the pleasure to introduce is Sally Rosen Kindred, and her book, Where the Wolf, is what she'll be reading from today. In Where the Wolf, the poet opens doors to the worlds of Red, who is not trapped in the woods of a fairy tale, but reborn, remade in this world as we know it, and dwells in the body of the speaker and other characters who live in the body of this book. In serious play, we see the speaker as both wolf and the wolfed, shaper and shifter of family stories, breaking out and back into her skin, telling us what it's like to have, to hold, to lose, and spin a narrative that haunts and saves through song and memory. Songs are a mercy, we are told, and the past is full of hungry ghosts, not fed but nursed, because wolf is the ghost of a heart remembering itself, which enables the speaker to recognize the agency that comes from not choosing the nature or form of her ghosts, but rather allowing them to do what they will do, even when she wonders how she could have saved them. Let us welcome Sally.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much, Mildred. It's a gift to be read and understood so well. So I thank you, and thanks to Malaprops for having me. And I'm so thrilled to read with Rick and Crystal today. As Mildred said, I'll be reading from Where the Wolf, which is out from Diode Editions since June 15th. And I'm going to start by reading the first poem in the book, which is called First Night. 2 hours after my father left for good, with his wet hair, lamp gleam black, and his zippered bag, my mother pulsed through the house, turning off all the lights. I followed her, then sat on the rug in the dark, watching smoke twist up from her cigarette and drop small stars to burn into her blouse, black with blue roses. I did not yet believe in the kitchen to come, in bottles that lit and littered the air, tilting here from the future, that God could lay her down years on that couch. I looked up at her. I touched the rug's braid. Behind her head, 4 cold windows. Beyond them, outside, in grass moon wet with night, a ghost wolf guarded the yard. In memory, she moves out now from the alders and skirts the silver swings. Her tufts bristle in the grass. We had called her name with a snap of the switch from the glass white globe, turn of the lamp's brass key, with our breath and fingers. Without that dark, wolf could never have found us. She could not have come to me, would not have felt safe. My mother was sagging already, losing stars, buckling under her story. Pain found me wolf's ghost body, gave me never and fur. I dreamed, I hid, I held. I would not tell. So that poem introduces a family, and the poems are a lot about being a daughter. It also introduces a wolf, a particular wolf, a she-wolf. And this next poem is more about her, and it's called Is She? You think this is the poem Where the Wolf. The forest, after all, is a sleeve of glass daggers. You, the girl, cold throat, wet shoes. Wolf is the ghost of a hurt remembering itself. Is she? You can hear her between trees. You can see the ghost her mouth was, weaving wet fur in the shards. If the forest is an altar built in the crack of your lost one's femur, then this is the moment when the girl is you kneeling before it. Wolf says, scarlet bird is the one with a scar in it. Wolf says, gather stones. Will be the end of the story of the wolf moving slowly across the sentence you have been speaking since before you were born. You say what a stone says in the pocket of your dress and forget you were ever a wing. As I said, the poems are a lot about being a daughter, but there are also poems about being a mother. And so I'm going to read one of those now, which I actually haven't read before aloud, so this will be interesting. This poem was written with my son in mind, but it addresses not my son, but Charles Dickens. And I had the pleasure of going to Dickens' house at one point 7 years ago, and seeing some of the places where he'd lived, including Wish Street, which comes up in the first stanza, and Hungerford Stairs. And these names are so evocative, but they're real names. So this poem is called To Dickens at 10. I'll see you at the fair end of Wish Street, then Hungerford Stairs, horse dung, mud-crowned boots, skin of soot. I see you gluing the 53rd paper label to the blacking can and wishing the work undone, the way later your words would peel a salt husk off a star. I see creases in your bending hand through the skin of your story's dirty attic glass. I see you. I have a son your age. I have a boy who wakes at 6 to make paper in his own image, to tear the pulp flat world into wings. And Charles, it's all violence, the rise of his bones from the sheets, the ripping back. In blue hours, he tears from sleep to make his books, to make them feathers, spears, make shields and songs of shields, so the papers swell over the rug, pile like choked fish in the Thames, and fill the ashy rivers of our afternoons. He makes airplanes, Charles, if you could just imagine. And I think about spontaneous combustion. I think you would understand the hunger, the fear, the expectation of fire. And I put the kettle on and wish your mother mourning in a warm white cup, an easy death. Too late, I wish her hand on your hands, well turned and warm as ash. The next poem is a kind of sequel to the very first poem that I read first night. It happens later in the collection, but definitely calls back to that first poem. It's called Coda, the Night Glass. When I was 10, she set a glass of wine on the table. My mother knew to praise the paints for night, currant, rookwood, garnet, stirred in the drift, shade of a hood, her thirst unsleeved in parts, a stem first, a mouth. My mother's lips, though, were a blue envelope, a glued wing, a flap could keep her sleep's secrets. Late at night, the glass would crack. Its whistle split shingles, let the sky inside. She made it. Her fear named the parts. Night sky, a stem. Night sky, a mouth. She could drown a hyacinth. She could thread a wolf through the moon. When I was 10, a glass of wine. Now I howl when it spills over. I stain when it slips through. She'll say crimson. No, invention. Call the red dress my dream. I wake hard, a daughter. I break back into my skin. I'm just going to read 2 more poems. This next one is yet another poem about being a daughter, and particularly to an adult daughter of a mother with dementia. It's called when you call my body an odd thing. Once I was the sonnet inside you, fetal, compressed. Remember our thirst? And what you wanted, garnet words turning in their beds. This was back when you held weather before you felt it break. Back before the fathers and their pills, the winds that shrilled and shrank us. Sorry, you almost wrote, rhyming worry into my heart's code. Once I was the umbrella. Inside you, the dead sent rain. I know now I was something held, your little shadow, little shade. I opened to catch a bright stigma of stars that fell across dark fields. Then our hurts became finger-painted roses, sealed, full-blown and folded flat, unpeeling into wet, mirrored blooms. Now you can't hold me anymore. You see the sky, strange and heavy. You hand me your lipstick, your purse, hard things that shine night black and away. You look into them and see your body, your body. Mother, if you don't know me now, don't you know the stone I was inside you? Can't you make room for the ring beneath your tongue? Just open your hand a minute, hold it. You don't have to call it blue or beautiful. You don't have to keep it warm. And the last poem I'm going to read, and I want to thank everybody again for letting me participate and for being here today. The last poem is a dream poem. Sometimes these poems are about wolves and sometimes they're a little tamer, sometimes they're about dogs. So this one comes near the end of the collection and it's called Evensong. At midlife, I dream of Penny, Bridget, Tilly, the neighborhood dogs, all dead by the late 80s, pressing their tender heads into last century's laps, or racing us on our wet bikes up Kemp West, nosing my empty keds in the grass. One dusk, I left the house through my brother's window, sneakers slapping porch brick, curled knee to chin behind azaleas steaming with moths. My mother had thrown a book, then a shelf of books, their blue and brown leathers fanning. My father back there laughing, and her yell stained the glass I'd slid shut. Across the street swung Tilly's rust-setter head, dark lantern in the weeds, and dusk red she turned and knew me, her eyes, her ears rising when she rose and came to her curb as if I were a sister or a mercy. She stopped there, sat, tongue loose, eyes sorrow soft, regarded me from the other side. After that, the street was silver blue. Now that I am pages and grass inside and have found her vesper body again, fur heavy in the dark, I stand. I step down into the leaves. I stop at my father's Chevy. I'll say, Tilly. I'll sing to her, make haste. From our drive, I'll praise, hallelujah. Grief is not for standing in the road. Grief waits at the edge of its yard, moves its tail when it sees me still. I want her, but I won't move. I'll say, sit, Tilly, good girl. I'll say, stay. Thank you.
That was very powerful, Sally. Thank you so much. And now it is my pleasure to welcome the poet Rick Mulkey and his book, All the Hungers. In All the Hungers, Rick not only shows us what to savor through taste and touch, the pleasures of tongue and flesh, where to find the best bacon in the Eastern US while celebrating the parts that make up the whole. But he also reveals the rituals of stripping off or a paring down of clutter after all the feral appetites have been assuaged and hangovers diminished. what remains, the essentials, quiet communion with a loved one working side by side, Bluefield, Virginia, and wonders of the mundane at the hardware store, such as nails and hammers when you need them, screws and pipes, each tool fashioned to a purpose, capable of resolving any complication with a simplicity of action we could easily define as a form of beauty. And finally, to arrive at the end and discover what is meant by a true beginning. Rick, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Mildred. Thank you, Patricia, also for helping out. And thanks to Malaprops for allowing me to be here and read with Sally and Crystal. I appreciate it. I'm going to read almost exclusively from all these hungers, and then I'll read one poem from a new anthology that just came out too. I thought I'd start with the first poem in the collection. It's a poem called Concerning Whiskey. And as Mildred was saying, the book really is about all kinds of different hungers and longing and wishing. And so while a lot of the poems sort of use food as imagery, not all of them do, but certainly you'll see some things like that in Concerning Whiskey and other poems. So anyway, Concerning Whiskey. Potent, peaty, brine-filled dram like the salt-washed rocks of sheltered bays, like the turf fires beneath thatched roofs, like rain falling hard and soot blackening the stone hearth, like the venerable who curl into themselves and wait for spring, old women grown diaphanous who flutter like moths embalmed in their silver-haired cocoons, aged at last into their ghostlier selves. Like their men, no longer storming pastures as fierce scouring winds, but lost in their suffering, now gnaw remorse and grasp at guilt as they once did pipe and pint. This is the alchemy of fire and air, the chemistry of creek and valley, the distillate of place and time, distillate of memory, soft, sugary, amber-clouted elixir like the lure of meadowsweet and chicory, like October smoke hanging over maple and oak, like the sophistry of sex on sunlit mornings in late December. Cold hands along the flushed length of spine and breast, breath passing across the altar of tongue, frosting bedroom windows. Like the dulcet notes of mandolin, the sorrowful soaring of fiddle, the primal groan of Cash's Ring of Fire, or Elvis's moaning call to love me tender. This is the push and pull, the liquid mystery train of peril and possibility we can't explain, though it carries a little of everything. The bog, the raison d'etre, the pie safe and gun safe, the morning promises and midnight faults, the scars forgotten and reclaimed, the ice in expectation clanging in a glass. I think I'll read, I'm going to read sort of by going from sort of beginning toward the end of the collection. I may skip around just a little bit, but mostly that's how I'm going to go. So this next poem is actually one that Mildred sort of referenced. It's a poem called Cured. And while it is sort of about bacon, it's about, I hope, a lot of other things too, both things political, personal, and spiritual. But it's also a poem for a friend of mine, for Albert Goldbarth. So, Cured. Albert, I'm here to tell you Bluefield, Virginia has the best bacon in the eastern US. I know you've never been there, but it's the kind of place you might visit on a Sunday. Clear blue sky and mountain ridges frosted, when all the evangelicals in their aging chapels and strip mall sanctuaries are off to pray that folks like you and me won't turn their fruitful lands into a salty waste. And you'd be left alone, or nearly so, and the only diner open on a Sunday morning. Just like me, you'd be lured in by the satisfying aromas of peppered pork belly, the sensation of eating the blistered fat of swine. We wouldn't care that it was spiritually unclean or that all it touched was unclean. The unclean plate, the unclean scrambled eggs, the filthy toast and jam. The way our fingers, lathered in its fatty sweetness, were unclean, or our mouths unclean, or the BLT we'd pile high in bacon unclean. And later, as we'd walk the empty streets before the local parishioners labored out to find their way home to sanctified roasts they'd ravaged from pristine platters, you and I and our friends would grow hungrier and hungrier as we'd compare the subtle flavors of acorn and truffle, the sugary, salty depth of pig. Then you'd quote from Sushi, Marshall, or Matthew's sensuous Song of Swine, sui generis. And we'd agree that eventually we'll all be offered up on one altar or another, salted with fire and smoke, salted with age, salted in baths, entering a covenant of salt, cured, if you will, of any worries about what might come to pass tomorrow. And knowing this life is one life and wanting to make the most of it, we'd pick up a glass of very cold, very sweet tea at the Dairy Queen, and we'd unwrap our sandwiches, drink deeply from the cup, and eat of the crispy flesh, satisfied celebrants of this porcine priesthood. So I grew up in Southwest Virginia, a little town called Bluefield, which is mentioned in that last poem. And so Southwest Virginia, Southern West Virginia, those were all sort of places where I sort of wandered and sort of learned about the world a little bit. And so this poem references some of that area as well. It's a poem called Mingo County Men. If you know anything about Mingo County, it might be that it's for a county its size, it has one of the worst drug problems in the world. But anyway, Mingo County Men. When I knew them as boys, shooting spitwads at Principal Martin and sneaking peeks at the fishnet hose of our young fourth grade teacher, Ms. McCall, they already sneered like grown men with jobs as haul truck drivers or long wall miners for Independence coal. They already had wives whose girlhood dreams had fallen flat as cakes dislodged from easy bake ovens, whose cheerleader smiles were swapped for a bud and a bottle of Oxy. Even then, slipping on sneakers instead of steel-toed boots, their houses had an air of lumberyard sawdust and coal tar pitch. Their lunches carried the stench of onions and potted meat. Their hands, stained yellow by camels they'd snatched from their father's packs, were already calloused and gashed. And how they dropped, then crushed the finished butts beneath their feet, said failure, though they still stood, that harness of smoke encircling them, watching and waiting for their futures to begin. This is a poem I actually haven't read a lot, but just recently I've started reading it a little bit more. I haven't read it a lot because it's a poem that's not about me per se, and it's not about men per se. And so I always felt a little uncomfortable with it, but a couple of good friends had said that they thought it was fine that I read this poem, so I'm going to go ahead and do so. It's called Cheerleaders at 40. They're in love again with the old language of lunge and kick. While others rush to work, they're framed in windows at the local gym, training in Pilates. Their children preened and packed off to school. Their husbands, former quarterbacks and point guards, huddled in insurance office cubicles. Even now, their schoolgirl voices overheard in grocery stores and shopping malls could rile the marching band's tight-lipped clarinetists who hated them. Their rouged cheeks, mascara-lined eyes, their moussed hair, how each sweater hid little from the crowd, how they bend on hands and knees, then rise in pyramids. Despite the talk, few boys ever loved them in breath-fogged Fords, desiring them most haloed by stadium light in late September, before adolescence burned to cinders in factory fires. Now at the gym, they're pedaling stationary bikes, swimming laps and hovering above ellipticals, attempts to stop their universe from flying into entropy. Anything to halt the memory of their breath ghosting in the cold of those Friday nights when the final whistle blew and the frost, without warning, began blooming all around them. I'll read two more. Let's see. This one is called Toolbox. Toolbox. I don't think there's anything in here that I would need to explain. So here we go. Toolbox. When he gave me the one his father had given him, he said, "A good tool invites you to pick it up." His were hands that held many, knew the difference between the weight and balance of a ratcheting wrench and a spark plug wrench. His were arms that lugged power tools, hand tools, vintage woodworking tools, garden tools, and a lunch pail of the kind no one owns anymore. His was a back bent beneath the labor only men and women used as tools can know. Bent in the bean fields and the hay fields, bent by shingles carried up the roofer's ladder, bent by the concrete mixer, bent by the sledgehammer and shovel, the jackhammer, the hoe and spade, the engine block. His were palms that knew other palms by their calluses or lack of calluses. Knew my hands were familiar with keyboards and ballpoint pens and understood those were tools too. Knew we all were tools of war and power, tools of lust and loss, tools that eventually lost their use, grown weak from age, rusted from neglect. When he asked me to help with repairs after a storm, I knew this was work he could no longer do alone. I brought the toolbox with me. I handed him a hammer and waited to follow his lead as I always had, knowing sometimes trying is all that's asked. Sharing the small losses, this tinkering with our hands can almost fix. I'm going to finish. This will be the last poem. I'm actually going to finish with an older poem, one that's not in All These Hungers, but that is actually in a new anthology from Clemson University Press called Ice on a Hot Stove that I co-edited with Denise Duhamel. And it sort of collects a decade of Converse MFA poetry from alums and faculty. And so I'll finish with it. It's a poem called Why I Believe in Angels. Thanks again to everyone for listening. And again, thanks to Mildred and everyone at Malaprops. I appreciate it very much. Why I Believe in Angels. Because I've seen their musculature joined hip to hip in parked cars, their bones under the glisten of skin twisting into flight. Because I've seen them rock through one another in that oldest of nights, in that moonless hour of clarity when the field mouse briefly turns its head from danger and only a wing beat marks its passing. Because I've heard them speak in tongues in late night bars as their bodies writhed in the stage's strobed light. Because I've seen their breasts encircled in the incense of cigarette, and I've held their hearts beating planchette and deciphered scribbled prophecies on back alley walls and discovered their words, like ours, are mere ticks on a clock. Because I believe the quark and lepton that leaped from lovers' mouths were once part of a rotting branch on Centauri Prime, and because I wake at night full of a past compressed beside me, the voices of friends whose wives left or husbands cheated, who faced with such truths are certain they didn't know. I stood there, they confess, though someone else possessed my body. Then all I can imagine are the unpaid bills a life accumulates, the voracious guilts and minor misdemeanors, the interpenetration of morphogenetic fields that allows the rat in Seattle to convey the way through the maze to a rat in Boston, to the rat inside my head. And because I can't ignore these signs, because I can't ignore, I find, without looking or understanding, my wife's hands or my son's hands crossed upon my chest. And there, like two wings, they've ended their journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick Mulkey, for that powerful reading. And before I introduce our last poet today, who is Crystal Stone, I would like to mention that our listeners out there, feel free to type in the chat any question you may have for these three poets. At the end of the reading, if we have some time left, I will ask them to respond to your questions. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Crystal Stone through her poetry and publication, All the Places I Wish I Died. In All the Places I Wish I Died, the poet reveals what is and what appears to be the mystery of life and love. Consider a cowbird dropping her young into another bird's nest and watching closely for signs of abuse or affection, never interfering except when the fledgling is murdered. All kinds of mistaken appearances converge. Things that aren't right look as if they are. A baby toad is assumed to be a cricket, a stone, and discovered too late after it's been flattened. Not unlike the speaker in the poem, perhaps recalling all the places and incidents of our mutual miscalculations when one is deflated under someone else's momentum, bouncing into it even when one intends to jump out. The heart in these poems is a tender wound, letting us know softly, fiercely, that loving life perhaps means embracing all its dangers rather than stepping out of harm's way. Crystal, you're welcome.
Can you guys hear me? Okay, perfect. Sorry. I apologize in advance for my appearance. I actually am driving across the country to my new home in Oklahoma today. And so that's why I have like this like background to hide it from you. My entire life is in my car. So I'm going to read a couple of poems. This one's called Thinking I Can Drive After Clearing the Snow Off Only My Windshield. As soon as I stopped, everything I hadn't cleared fell from the top and blocked my view. My therapist asked, when will you forgive yourself? I considered telling her how my friend's snake squeezed a heart from the mouse it devoured, how there's something funny in every tragedy. Avoidant, she'd write in the session notes or say aloud as I left for another walk in the snow. At the military academy, my dad got beat with socks full of soap for mouthing off because everyone had to do more push-ups than they could handle. In place of a lock, he disassembled a hairdryer to protect himself, made the doorknob electric to touch. He's always remembered better than he remembers. We share a hit as we walk, and I know I am my father's daughter. The last time I left home, a toddler in the airport said hi relentlessly. If I didn't listen closely enough, it was hard to tell if she said hi or bye. The only difference between the words is the way the mouth opens. My next poem, On the Shortest Day of the Year. She told me she could teach me to relax. We settled into bed, stripped down to our words. Before the sun fell, somewhere a man rode a bicycle on a lake I hadn't yet known. In the middle, at the thinnest part of the ice, my therapist asked, "Why do you feel guilty? He didn't drown." In bed, she lifts the covers, her lips a slit sun on a blush horizon. No blue light blaze bothering our eyes awash. Somewhere outside her room, someone burned a Confederate flag and it looked like America. Not our quiet night, where she taught me to care for myself despite the dimming of outside flames, the soft glow, the accumulating ash. This one's called Portrait of the Alcoholic's Daughter. I never know until it happens, the day you start to understand the hollow cello in my living room, dusty candles on my dresser, clothes picked from others' discards. I find love the same way. I try to imagine it's possible to build a house of straw when it's all there is to use. The gypsy moth can't think about shelter. Her young birth parasitic flies and die. My mother lit red candles on the floor with faces of saints. She didn't bring them the day I saw my first ghost. I was 6, walking through the narrow motel hallway in the middle of nowhere. There was blood on the headboard. Mom told me to stop telling stories. My brother was silent. There was nothing to say when this happened. It wasn't the first day I woke up in the middle of a nightmare, her screaming, "Why aren't you happy?" I felt guilty ever since. My brother begs me to stop. He loved her in a way I did not until I read the poem she wrote about me 10 years before I was born. She died 7 years ago now, in her bed next to a man she didn't love, but I sleep more soundly next to you than I ever have next to someone else, and prepare for the sun to argue with the moon about what time it is, always trying to outshine the other, chronically far apart. This one's called Last Iowa Caucus. It's actually in a book coming out in the spring next year. And it was about my experience at the Iowa caucus last year. I was living in Iowa at the time. Once open, the wine is a glassy rose in our cups. We cheer politely next to the dying dog. He labors to breathe like my own dog the day her stomach filled with blood like a patched and swollen moon. The moon doesn't make it dark, my friend tells her child when the child's eyes become planetary with questions. We have all been orbiting the food, the words, the song. A friend heads to the piano to play the grief we're all avoiding. Another reads tarot cards, tells us what we need to hear. Outside, next to the lake, mice and rabbit tracks are not parallel lines. I wonder who started the chase or if they were friends meeting for the first time. While we cross over politely, the geese and swan share the open water, the icy beach. On the other side of the bridge, a man corkscrews the ice open. The splinters on the surface extend, fingers of an open palm waiting to be held. And I guess for my last poem, I'll do something fun. Well, I think it's supposed to be fun. It's called Manic Pixie Drunk Girl. Her mood is a genie in a snow globe. Her look is a snow woman with a button nose, rhinestone lips, and 80s hair. Some days, all the hands shaking, the glass drop glitter in her strands. Sometimes they shake the perfect messy bun. In her purse, hanging off her branch-like arms, anything you might want. A flask, cigarettes, aspirin, marshmallows, chocolate, ready for any bonfire, ailment, or thirst. She makes me smile, boy, even hungover. All of her tears are tears of joy. Her nipples are warm coals in the February snow. She can open the closed sex shop to make sure you get the love you want. She only defeats you in bed, where she chokes the right part of your neck, bites your earlobes with pop rock sparks. Her limbs are monkey bars and you're always welcome. Don't shatter the glass, darling. Let your eyes accumulate the snow.
Thank you, Crystal. And we finished the reading early, so we do have time. Thank you, Crystal. We finished the readings early, so we do have time for questions. And our listeners out there, feel free to type in the chat. But in the meantime, I have a question for all the poets. If you could speak briefly about what poetry does for you. And anybody could begin.
For me, I think it helps me develop my emotional literacy. It helps me to get in touch with what I'm looking at, how I'm feeling, and also when I read other people's poems, how people in my life might have felt before when they've gone through things that maybe I haven't experienced yet. So I see poetry as like a tool that helps us like understand ourselves and others better and develop our understanding of the different like emotional experiences of being.
I love what Crystal said about emotional literacy. It's an interesting concept. I like that. I think that there's no way to talk about poetry for me without getting hyperbolic. I think for me, from early on, it felt like poetry was a way that the concentrated language of poetry creates this kind of experience, sort of like a mystic experience. It creates sort of moments of transport. I've just always been interested in how language, how words and their textures can create kind of a sensory experience that's more intense, I think. Not that I don't love fiction, and I love story and I love everything about story, but there's something about kind of the lyric moment and what poetry can do in its concentration that I think is sort of is mystic and creates these kind of mystic connections. And I guess that's what that draws me the most.
I don't know that I have anything that I can add that would be more interesting than what these two writers have already said. I mean, for me, I would suggest that it's a way for me to give shape and form to parts of a life that don't always seem to have shape and form. And as I was talking about, it's a way of sort of capturing that sort of moment, that singular moment, which we might think of as the lyric moment, in a way that no other work of literature can sort of do, I think. And the way that it sort of compresses language and heightens language and can bring music into the language. Those are all things that sort of draw me to poetry.
Wonderful. And we do have 3 questions coming to you. So one of them is from Catherine Carter, and she's asking how you're all writing or how your writing is going in the plague year. So maybe I won't mention the other questions. Let's first hear your responses to that.
Hi, Catherine. I would have to say that in the plague year, it was probably not one of my better writing years. I was glad that I had a book project to work on. It gave me something to revise and to focus on in terms of that. But I actually found that I was writing really well before everything sort of hit, and then it became harder and harder, I think. I was mentioning at a reading the other day that I think generally I am an introvert, but I'm an introvert who needs an awful lot of external stimulation. And I found this past year not having all that stimulation was sort of made the writing a little more difficult for me, at least.
I'm another person who benefited from having just finished a book length project, Where the Wolf, right as the plague year was starting. So I had that kind of structure. I was doing the final revisions, and then the book got accepted, and then it was working on the book. That definitely helped me a lot, the same way I think Rick is saying about him. And as for the other side of it, producing new work, I actually sort of surprised myself. I had friends that I had planned to see for a week-long retreat in the summer of 2020, and that didn't happen because of COVID. And so we started meeting once a week, and we were really just writing during that, in our spots, in our different places in the country, and write on Zoom. If I hadn't had that, I think I was spinning out, and I would not have been able to sort of be disciplined. But I actually did do some writing, which I wasn't expecting to do. And it was because of the substitute experience, this virtual experience. So I learned something about, I couldn't go to coffee shops anymore, but I could have this kind of like coffee shop in my home, a virtual coffee shop. So I have done some new writing. But it's hard, and it's slower, much slower than in a normal year. And I feel like we all just need to give ourselves some grace with that. So.
For me, it's dependent on what part of the pandemic we're talking about. When the pandemic first started, I was in the last couple months of my MFA. And I had work working on, and the time to finish the project. When I graduated here at a nursing home, the job was so challenging that after work, I didn't really have the energy to write because there was just so much going on. But after that experience, once I got like a very boring remote job 24/7, and exposing my family to COVID, once I got a job like that, I was able to start writing again, and then I guess I've just started sending out, but yeah, so my experience has just been like, it's dependent on what job I was working and what my experience in the pandemic was. But yeah, the alone time actually like does help me write better. I need some social interaction, but what I was getting at work was like enough. So.
Thank you, Crystal. And at some point, I don't know how much the audience were able to hear you, because I think there is some interference from the wind and the road. So we do understand that. And we do have another question. This one is from Laura Brown, and it's addressed to Rick specifically. And she's asking about why I believe in angels, whether when you wrote this poem, if you were influenced by some of Thomas Kennedy's work.
Thanks, Laura, for the question. I mean, I certainly have read Thomas E. Kennedy's work a great deal. Wonderful novelist and story writer. If people don't know, he just recently passed away a couple of weeks ago. Was just a marvelous novelist and story writer and essayist. I don't know that it was specifically any of his work that sort of influenced it. As strange as it seems, that poem in a way came from a challenge that someone gave me with the word morphogenetic, which is in the poem. And this individual tried to sort of tell me that they just thought there were certain words that had no place in poetry, that they just weren't poetic, whatever that means. And I sort of disagreed and wanted to try to write a poem that suggested that even a word like morphogenetic had a place in poetry. And so that was part of the reason for the poem. And then also, this was written many years ago. It was this time period where those little toy angels were sort of everywhere, like every convenience store you walked into. And I thought they were horrible. And I thought, this is nothing like the sort of angelic figures I think of in my own mind. And so it was also in response to that.
Thank you. And this will be the last question from Katie Sherman. And she's asking what poets or writers you would like to recommend. And this is a question to all of you.
So many. I don't. It's hard to even know where to to start. But I certainly, for years now, one of my favorite poets for the last couple of decades has been Terrence Hayes. Everyone knows Terrence's work, I think, but certainly has been one of my favorite poets. Another friend of mine who actually has a new book coming out in September, who I think may be here listening, and I sort of want to recommend everyone go read his work, and that's Gary Jackson. And so if you haven't read Gary's work, he's got a brand new book coming out in September, so I hope you'll read it.
I think, Sally, you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry, I pressed the wrong button. I was trying to say I've been putting together an online class that I'm teaching this fall, and so right now my head is full of the writers that I'm teaching in that class. So the first author that occurs to me is Lucille Clifton, who is just she's sort of in my pantheon. She's a light, and she's well from New York, but also from Baltimore, so from this area. And all of her work, Blessing the Boats, is a selected poems. I think it came out in 2000 that I've been working with for this class. But also a brand new book, which I just love, is by the poet Kelly Crescio Muller, and it's called Shade of Blue Trees. It's out from Two Sylvia's Press. And I love the work that Kelly is doing with kind of surreal imagery, and also just writing about, I guess, grief and midlife, and women's lives and bodies and all of that. I think is centering those experiences. So I'd recommend that new book.
Thank you. And we do have Crystal's recommendation in the chat, which include Ocean Wang's book and Catherine Barnett's Human Hours, Deborah Kwan, Lunch Portraits, and then Diana Seuss is another favorite. So that's a poet. And I would imagine maybe Ocean Wang's book could be The Exit Wound, or the novel, which is kind of autobiographical and actually a great book to read. So I thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. This is Malaprop's POETRIO events. Every first Sunday of the month, we gather here at 3 p.m. to talk about poetry and enjoy listening to poets read to us. And I would encourage you next September on 5th to tune in and again join us. I am Mildred Barya, and it's been my pleasure to introduce Sally Kindred, Rick Mulkey, and Crystal Stone. Thank you so much. And our wonderful listeners out there, thank you again for sparing time this afternoon to join us. I look forward to doing another poetry show next month. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.